After my daughter told me I wasn't sophisticated enough to meet her fiance's parents, I quietly stopped paying her rent. 4 days later, I had 31 missed calls waiting on my phone. I'm Harold Whitfield, 68 years old, and for 3 years I had been secretly covering the $3,600 monthly rent on the downtown luxury condo where my daughter Blair lived, while I stayed in a rented room above a hardware store I used to own before I sold the business. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I spent 36 years as a master electrician, then built a small chain of hardware stores from nothing, and I know precision. I know that a circuit either holds or it doesn't, that a connection either carries the load or it burns out. Family, I came to learn, works exactly the same way. Before I continue, let me know in the comments which state you're watching from tonight, and if you've ever had a child underestimate what you built with your own two hands, hit that like button for me. When my wife Carol died 4 years ago, the house we'd shared for 30 years turned into a museum of silence. Every room held her voice, her habits, the smell of her hand cream on the bathroom counter. I couldn't stand it. Around that same time, Blair had just gotten engaged to a man named Preston, whose family owned 3 car dealerships across 2 counties. Blair had always had expensive taste and a modest income working in event coordination, and suddenly she needed a life that matched Preston's world. She needed the condo with the marble countertops. She needed the wardrobe. She needed, she said, to not embarrass herself. I sold my hardware store to a regional chain for a number that would have shocked her, though she never knew it. I told Blair I was struggling to keep the family business afloat and that the sale barely covered my retirement. I told her I'd co-signed a lease for her because her credit wasn't strong enough yet and that I'd help with rent just until she got settled. I moved into a rented room above what used to be my own store, sleeping on a twin bed with a window unit that rattled all summer, wearing the same 3 flannel shirts I'd worn for a decade. I did this on purpose. I wanted to see, once I appeared to have nothing left, whether my daughter would still want me around. The answer arrived slowly, and it arrived cold. The calls came on schedule, always about money. Dad, Preston's mother is hosting a dinner and I need a dress. Can you send $400? Dad, the condo association is charging a special assessment. I need $1,100 by Friday. Dad, I need you to cover my car payment this month. Work's been slow. Never, how are you feeling? Never, are you eating well in that little room? I have a bad knee that aches worse every winter. And in 3 years, not once did she ask about it. There were only invoices, delivered in her sweet, practiced voice. The same voice she used when she wanted something as a little girl. I paid every single one. I was running a test on my own daughter, and I was documenting every result. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in early November, 3 weeks before Preston's parents' annual family harvest dinner, an event I'd heard about for months but had never once been invited to. I decided to surprise her. I drove 40 minutes into the city in my old work truck, wearing my good flannel and the one clean pair of jeans I owned, carrying a bottle of the wine Carol used to like and a card I'd written for Blair, just wanting to see my daughter's face. I parked outside her building and called her from the lobby, telling the doorman I was here to see Blair Whitfield. She came down to meet me instead of buzzing me up. That should have told me everything right there. She stepped out into the lobby wearing a cream-colored dress I didn't recognize. Her hair done, a diamond bracelet catching the light. She looked at my truck through the glass doors before she even looked at me. Dad, she said, keeping her voice low, glancing back toward the elevator. What are you doing here? I told her I just wanted to say hello, that I'd brought a little something for her. She didn't take the wine. She told me Preston's parents were upstairs right now, that they'd come by unannounced to drop off engagement gifts, and that this was not a good time. I asked if I could just come up for 5 minutes, meet them properly since the wedding was getting close. Her face did something I'll never forget, a kind of wince, like she'd bitten into something rotten. Dad, she said, you don't really fit the picture I built for them. They think my father is a retired business owner who golfs on weekends. I can't have you showing up in a work truck looking like you just came from changing someone's oil. Just go home. I'll call you. I stood there in that marble lobby holding a bottle of wine my dead wife used to love. And I understood, the way you understand a wire has gone cold, that there was no current left running between us. I didn't argue. I set the wine down on the concierge desk, told the doorman it was a gift for Miss Whitfield in 14C, and I walked back out to my truck. I sat behind the wheel in the parking garage for a long moment before I even started the engine. I am not a man who explodes. Anger, uncontrolled, is wasted energy. I channel it. I redirect it. I drove 3 miles to an all-night diner, ordered black coffee, and pulled out my phone. I opened my banking app and scrolled to the automatic transfer I'd set up 3 years earlier. $3,600. Recipient: Sterling Property Management, Blair, Whitfield, Unit 14C. Scheduled for the first of the month, 11 days away. For 3 years, that payment had never once failed. It was the reason she could wear diamond bracelets and host imaginary in-laws in a condo she couldn't have qualified for on her own salary. I looked at that red cancel button for a long moment. Then I pressed it. A confirmation popped up. Are you sure you want to permanently cancel this recurring transfer? Yes. The transfer vanished. The money stayed exactly where it was, in my account. I exhaled, and something in my chest that had been twisted tight for 3 years finally loosened, just slightly. I drove home to my rented room and slept better than I had in months. She didn't find out until 8 days later, when the property management office sent an automated notice that her rent draft had failed. My phone rang for the first time at 9:40 in the morning. I let it ring. Voicemail. Dad, call me back. Something's wrong with the bank thing. Probably just a glitch. Call me. I made my coffee. I did not call. The calls kept coming, spaced roughly every 20 minutes with a kind of mechanical panic. By call number 11, her voice had lost its sweetness. Dad, seriously, this isn't funny. I have people to answer to. By call 17, she was crying, the anger curdling into fear. Dad, if I don't fix this today, they're going to file a notice. Please call me. I sat in my quiet little room above the old hardware store, listening to the window unit hum, and I let the phone buzz against the wooden nightstand like a trapped insect. This was not cruelty. This was an audit. I needed to see exactly how deep the rot went before I decided what to repair and what to remove. By the time the call count reached 31, it was nearly midnight, and the final voicemail was different from all the rest. Her voice had cracked entirely. Dad, please, I'm sorry about the other night. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. Please, I'm begging you, call me back. I called her back the next morning. Not because of the apology, because I needed her to come see me in person, and I needed her to bring her fiancé. But before that meeting happened, I did something I hadn't planned on, something that changed everything. I want to back up here, because there's a piece of this you need to understand. 4 years ago, when Carol was first diagnosed with early-stage kidney failure, before the pancreatic cancer that eventually took her, I opened a joint account specifically to manage her dialysis costs and specialist bills. I added Blair as a secondary signer because I traveled often for supplier meetings, and I needed someone local who could authorize emergency payments if I couldn't get to a branch in time. I told Blair explicitly, this money is for your mother's care and nothing else. After Carol passed, I never closed that account. I left roughly $62,000 sitting in it, untouched, a strange kind of memorial I couldn't bring myself to disturb. The morning after that 31st voicemail, before I called Blair back, I drove to my bank and it asked to speak with a manager. I told him I wanted a complete statement history on that joint account, going back 2 years. A young manager named Devin pulled the records and printed them without a word of concern until he actually looked at the totals. The balance was not $62,000, it was $4,112. I sat there in that small glass office feeling something cold settle into my spine. I asked Devin to print the itemized withdrawal history. He did, and I read through it the way I used to read through electrical schematics, looking for the fault. Every single month, on almost the same date, exactly $2,000 had moved out of that account. Not to a hospital, not to a pharmacy. The destination was a joint checking account belonging to Blair, and, as of 8 months ago, Preston. I asked Devon to trace where that money actually went after it landed in her account. Because the accounts were linked under the bank's fraud monitoring system, he was able to pull it. $650 a month to a private country club where Preston's family held a membership. $900 a month toward a lease on a white convertible I'd seen parked outside her building. The rest, scattered across boutiques and a spa downtown. My late wife's dialysis fund, the money set aside so she could die with dignity and without financial terror, had been quietly drained for 3 years to buy my daughter a life she couldn't otherwise afford. Devin cleared his throat and told me that, because Blair was a legal co-signer, technically these were authorized transactions. The bank couldn't call it theft. From an administrative standpoint, she'd had every right to move that money. I told him I understood. I asked him to freeze every account attached to my name immediately, requiring my physical presence for any future transaction. I watched him lock it all down. And then, almost as an afterthought, he clicked into another tab, hesitated, and turned his monitor to face me. 5 months earlier, someone had opened a $28,000 personal line of credit against that same joint account, using the remaining balance as collateral. It had been maxed out within 10 days. The funds had gone to a bridal boutique and an event planning company for what I could only assume was wedding-related spending, all under my name. I leaned in and looked at the signature on the digital application. I have signed my name on electrical permits and business contracts for 40 years. My signature is tight, angular, controlled. This signature was loose and rounded, written by someone in a hurry, someone imitating a shape they'd only seen a few times. My daughter had forged my name to secure $28,000 for her wedding. The betrayal on that lobby floor had been cruelty. This was something else entirely. This was a felony. I asked Devin to print everything, stamp it, and seal it in an envelope. He offered to connect me with the bank's fraud department. I told him not yet. Instead, I drove downtown to see a man named Walter Briggs, a corporate attorney who'd handled contract disputes for my old hardware chain for 15 years. Walter had no patience for sentiment and even less for excuses. When I told him the full situation, laying the printed statements flat across his desk, he went quiet in a way I recognized as focus, not shock. Walter explained that civilly, this was going to be difficult because I'd made Blair a co-signer myself years ago. A judge might see it as a father generously supporting his daughter, misguided but not illegal. But when he reached the final page, the forged credit application, his whole posture changed. He took off his glasses. He asked me directly if I had signed that document. I told him I had not touched that account in 4 years. Walter told me that forging a signature to secure a line of credit was federal wire fraud, plain and simple. He said we needed patience, not anger. He said desperate people make mistakes. And Blair, cut off from her only source of money 3 weeks before a major wedding, was about to become very desperate indeed. He drafted something too, quietly, off to the side. A formal notice terminating the lease guarantee I'd provided, since I was the one who'd actually qualified her for that condo in the first place, using my own credit as backing. Without my guarantee, the building had every right to require her to requalify on her own income within 30 days or vacate. I went home. I did not call Blair that day after all. I let the silence do the work. 3 days later, she showed up at my rented room above the hardware store, and she was not alone. Preston came with her, still in his work clothes, his jaw tight. Blair pushed past me into the small room the second I opened the door, snow melting off her boots onto the old wood floor. She told me the leasing office had called her that morning demanding proof of independent income within 30 days or she'd be evicted. She told me this had to be some kind of mistake, that I needed to fix it right now. I told her to sit down. She didn't. Preston stood near the door with his arms crossed, looking at the cramped little room, the hot plate, the narrow bed, with open disgust. I told them both, calmly, that I hadn't guaranteed a mortgage or co-signed anything charitable 3 years ago. I told them I had personally qualified for that lease, using my own income and credit, because Blair's numbers alone would never have gotten her approved for a building like that. I told her that as of 11 days ago, my guarantee was formally withdrawn, and that the rent she'd assumed was somehow covering itself had, in fact, been coming directly out of my retirement account the entire time. Blair's face went the color of old paper. She said that was impossible, that she'd been paying her own rent for years. I told her the automatic transfer she'd never once questioned was mine, and it no longer existed. Preston finally spoke. He said this was insane, that a father doesn't just abandon his daughter over hurt feelings from one bad night at her building. I looked at him and told him this was not about hurt feelings. I reached into my coat and pulled out the folded bank statements. I placed them on the small table between us. I told Blair I knew about the dialysis account. I told her I knew, dollar for dollar, where $60,000 of her dying mother's medical fund had gone. I watched something break behind her eyes. She started to cry, the same performance I'd heard through 31 voicemails. And she said it wasn't like that she'd meant to pay it back, that she was going to fix it before the wedding. I told her there was one more page. I placed the forged credit application on the table last. I watched Preston pick it up first, scanning the numbers, then flip to the signature line. I watched him look up at Blair with an expression I hadn't expected. Not defense, suspicion. Blair grabbed for the paper, but I'd already memorized every detail. I told her I knew that signature wasn't mine, because I've signed my name the same tight, deliberate way for 40 years, and this was a stranger's attempt at forgery. I told her the bank had already flagged the account and that forging a signature on a federal credit application was not a family matter anymore. It was a crime. Preston set the paper down slowly. He asked her quietly if it was true. Blair didn't answer him. That silence answered for her. I told them both they had 30 days before the lease guarantee formally expired, and that whatever happened after that was between Blair and the leasing office, not me. I told Preston I was sorry he'd been pulled into something he clearly hadn't known about. And I told Blair, without raising my voice even once, that I loved the daughter I raised, but I no longer recognized the woman standing in my room. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. 2 days later, Walter called me into his office, his voice tighter than I'd ever heard it. He told me Blair, through a lawyer paid for with Preston's family's money, had filed an emergency petition asking a judge to appoint her as temporary guardian over my financial affairs, claiming I was showing signs of sudden erratic behavior and possible cognitive decline, citing my abrupt financial decisions and my isolated living situation as evidence. She'd attached a signed letter from a physician I had never once met in my life, a man named Dr. Callahan, stating I displayed symptoms consistent with early dementia. I sat in that office and felt something harden in me completely. They weren't just trying to survive the consequences of their own theft. They were trying to use my own generosity, twisted backward, as proof I was unfit to control my own money. Walter explained the mechanics calmly. This doctor, Callahan, ran a private wellness practice that catered to wealthy families in Preston's social circle, the kind of doctor who signed favors for a fee and never asked hard questions. Someone with money and connections had paid him to sign a diagnosis for a man he'd never examined. Walter told me we had one clean answer. I needed a full cognitive evaluation from a real, independent specialist, done immediately, with documentation airtight enough that no judge could question it. I drove to the State University Medical Center that same afternoon and spent nearly 4 hours being tested. Memory recall, spatial reasoning, detailed questions about my finances and my business history going back decades. The neurologist reviewing my results told me, flatly, that my cognitive function was well above average for a man my age, and she signed a 20-page certified report confirming it. We walked into that emergency hearing 8 days later. Blair's attorney stood and painted a picture of a grieving widower, spiraling into confusion, cutting off his only daughter out of paranoia. He presented Dr. Callahan's letter to the judge as proof. Walter stood, unbothered, and asked to see it. He noted aloud, for the record, the exact date it was signed, precisely 11 hours after I had formally canceled my lease guarantee. Then he handed the judge my 20-page evaluation from the university hospital. The judge read both documents side by side in silence. When she looked up, her expression had gone hard. She asked Blair's attorney to explain how his client secured a diagnosis of cognitive decline from a doctor who'd never once examined the patient, while the state's own certified specialist found nothing but sharp, healthy function. He had no answer. The judge dismissed the petition with prejudice on the spot and noted for the record that she found the timing deeply suspicious, suggesting it looked less like concern for a father's welfare and more like retaliation for a canceled lease guarantee. Blair sat frozen at the table. Preston wasn't with her that day. I noticed that. Walter told me afterward this wasn't over, that people this desperate rarely stop at one failed attempt, and he was right. 4 days later, I received a message from Blair asking to meet at Walter's office, saying she had new paperwork that would clear everything up. Walter had every recording device in his office ready before she arrived. She walked in with a different man this time, not a lawyer, a nervous, thin man in a cheap suit who introduced himself as a notary. He placed a single document on Walter's desk, a general power of attorney dated 14 months earlier, granting Blair full authority over my finances due to declining health. At the bottom was my signature, the same loose, hurried forgery as before, stamped and notarized as legitimate. Walter asked the notary to confirm, on the record, that he had personally witnessed me sign that document 14 months ago. The man swallowed hard and said yes. I spoke for the first time. I told him that 14 months ago, on that exact date, I was 2 states away testifying as an expert witness in an electrical code dispute in front of 11 other people with hotel records and travel logs to prove it. The color drained out of the notary's face so fast I thought he might faint. Walter didn't even raise his voice. He simply asked the man if he understood the federal penalties for notarizing a forged legal document used to conceal financial fraud. The notary admitted, stammering, that he'd been paid by Blair to backdate and stamp the document without ever meeting me at all. What none of us knew yet was that this notary had already been under federal investigation for unrelated document fraud for months and had agreed to cooperate with authorities in exchange for leniency. Every conversation he'd had with Blair arranging this forgery had already been recorded by federal agents before he ever walked into Walter's office. Blair didn't know that. She thought she'd found a way out. She had actually built the final piece of evidence against herself. 48 hours later, federal agents executed a warrant at the small townhouse Blair and Preston had moved into after the condo lease collapsed. I wasn't there to see it, but Walter described it to me afterward. Agents at the door before sunrise, Blair in tears being read her rights in her own driveway while neighbors watched from behind their curtains. The wedding, scheduled for 3 weeks later, was canceled. Preston's family, terrified of the scandal touching their dealerships, distanced themselves entirely. I heard, secondhand, that Preston ended the engagement the same week the charges were filed. At trial, months later, I sat in the gallery and listened to a federal prosecutor lay out, calmly and without embellishment, exactly how my daughter had drained her dying mother's medical fund to finance a country club membership and a leased convertible, then forged my signature not once but twice to cover her tracks. First for a credit line, then for a power of attorney meant to strip me of my own autonomy. I testified. I told the court about the night in that marble lobby, about being told I didn't fit the picture she'd built for people who were never going to matter as much as I once had. I told them I did not take pleasure in what was happening, but that I would not let my life be used as raw material for someone else's comfort. The judge sentenced Blair to 6 years for wire fraud and identity theft, with a mandatory restitution order covering every dollar taken from that dialysis account. I drove home that afternoon and did not feel triumphant. I felt something quieter, something settled. I still live in that small room above the old hardware store, though these days it's simply because I like the quiet, not because I need to hide what I have. I start my mornings early with black coffee and the newspaper, and some afternoons I sit at my old drafting table, sketching, wiring diagrams, for the pleasure of clean, correct logic, the kind that never lies to you and never asks you for anything you didn't agree to give. I think often about my grandson, Preston's nephew really, a boy named Cooper who used to call me Grandpa Harry at family gatherings before all of this happened. He wasn't Blair's child, but he'd grown attached to me over the years. And I to him. 2 months ago, I quietly reached out to his actual grandparents, people I'd always gotten along with, and asked if I might still be part of his life in some small way. Not through Blair, not through obligation, just because the boy deserved consistency somewhere. They said yes. I see him every other Sunday now. We build birdhouses in my little workshop, and he calls me every time he loses a tooth. I don't know if Blair and I will ever speak again. Some structures, once the load-bearing wall gives out, simply cannot be repaired without tearing the whole thing down and starting over, and I'm not certain either of us has the years left to rebuild something that size. But I've learned something in all of this that I wish I'd understood decades sooner. Loving someone unconditionally does not mean funding their delusions indefinitely. Sacrifice without respect isn't devotion. It's just theft with better manners. If you've ever had to walk away from someone who shared your blood but never earned your trust, tell me about it in the comments. I'd like to know I'm not the only one who had to learn this lesson the hard way.